Today I'm going to talk about Rift, an MMO that was released on March 1st, 2011 by Trion Worlds. Now this is the first game I chose to feature on my channel after quitting Warcraft, and that's basically because I was already somewhat familiar with the property. I originally played Rift when it was brand new. I was totally sold by the hype. I pre-ordered the game, I even bought the collector's edition. Of course, you all know I eventually returned to Warcraft, so you're probably expecting me to say that Rift fell flat, but that's not true. In fact, I actually enjoyed the game quite a bit back then. It made a really good first impression on me. There were two major roadblocks that kept me from sticking with Rift, however, and neither of them are really Trion's fault. Firstly, Warcraft was like a siren song, constantly beckoning for me to return. I had a really difficult time trying to ignore all the years of progress I'd simply abandoned by jumping into Rift. And secondly, my computer back in 2011 was pure garbage. I couldn't even run WoW on the highest settings. I had to crank the video options way down to play Rift. And even then, I still experienced difficulties from time to time. Playing the game solo or in small groups was fine for the most part, but trying to participate in Rift events was tough. So, I was playing a game called Rift and going out of my way to avoid the Rift mechanics. That was a fool's errand to say the least. Again, it's not Trion's fault, I just couldn't afford to buy a new computer at the time. I eventually canceled my Rift subscription and jumped back into Cataclysm. But now it's 2015 and times have definitely changed. All my WoW progress is more or less non-existent, and my current computer's a decent machine. So I wanted to give Rift another shot. And the game is free to play now, so I knew giving it a second test drive wouldn't cost me a thing, unless I personally chose to purchase something. I like having that kind of freedom and flexibility. Anyway, before I really begin this review, I want to quickly address the common complaints about Rift. People often think it's just another WoW clone, a total ripoff of everything Blizzard built, but if I was going to be that dismissive, there'd be no point in my reviewing any games, period. The entire video game industry has always cannibalized itself. Whether you think this copying is right or wrong is kind of irrelevant. It happens. When certain things work, they're gonna get copied, and that's just the way of the world. And Blizzard certainly isn't above this theft, if that's what you choose to call it. I could make an entire video just highlighting all the things WoW itself incorporated from other games. In fact, WoW didn't have AoE looting until after Rift did. I'm not saying Rift invented it, I'm just saying, in this particular instance, it was Rift who beat WoW to the punch. So while I'm not going to sit here and say Rift is the most innovative, original, cutting-edge game I've ever played, I'm also not going to shit all over it for playing very similar to WoW. Another common complaint about Rift I want to quickly acknowledge and then drop entirely concerns the game's graphics. I've heard a lot of people say that Rift looks bad. I actually think Rift looks fine, but graphics are totally subjective. I happen to like the dark and grimy feel of Rift. The muted color tones make Talara, the Rift homeworld, feel somewhat dingy and gross. I get a similar vibe from watching Game of Thrones. I love the show, and I really enjoy seeing that world through my TV screen, but I'd never want to actually live there. I'll admit, though, that the graphics in Rift haven't necessarily aged well. When the game was first released, I was floored by what I saw. Today, Rift looks average at best compared to newer video games. I've mentioned this before in one of my previous videos, and it's no big secret by any means. But WoW has a somewhat timeless quality to it because its graphics are stylized and cartoonish. Rift went for a more realistic approach to its visuals, and that probably hurt the game in the long run, from a mainstream point of view. Again, I think Rift's graphics are fine. To me, gameplay trumps graphics in most regards. I mean, I certainly have my limits as well. I won't play a game like Minecraft, for example, because the graphics are just too archaic for my taste. But in my opinion, Rift's visuals are certainly acceptable. Now that the major complaints have been dealt with, I want to talk about Rift's free-to-play business model. Living in my little Warcraft bubble, I always assumed that whenever a competing MMO ditched their subscription-based model for a free-to-play one, they were basically announcing to the world that they were failures. It was like the kiss of death for any franchise. But honestly, the more research I do on the subject, the more I grow to appreciate the free-to-play concept. That's not to say it's perfect or flawless by any means. Some companies definitely manage it better than others. But overall, this is a very broad topic that I'm not planning to tackle today. All I want to do right now is look mainly at Rift, and discuss if their free-to-play model works, because it's very important to Rift's lifespan. This may sound crazy, but in a nutshell, companies should want to attract freeloaders. MMOs need to be populated. A solid free-to-play business model breeds public interest. That interest results in high server populations. A fully populated world creates a feeling of security and stability within the game itself. The whales, as they're so callously called, the small portion of players who actually do spend their real-life money on shop items, will be more likely to buy things if they're confident the game's in good shape. Companies won't sell a lot of virtual product if their virtual world appears to be dying. So Trion's strength lies in how much they're willing to give players for free. They offer a subscription option, which they call becoming a patron, and while I'm not going to read off every perk patrons receive, I'll say most of them are actual perks, which is good. A lot of the time, in free-to-play models, the subscription options don't exactly grant perks, but eliminate roadblocks instead. Star Wars: The Old Republic, for example, restricts free players from accessing general chat, except on their planet of origin. They can only receive in-game mail, but they can't send any. They can only queue for 5 war zones a week, which are PvP battlegrounds. The list of restrictions goes on and on. There's only one real Rift perk that's an actual roadblock removal: extra daily quests. Patrons can do 10 more dailies a day than free-to-play players. I don't really see this as a huge deal though. An excessive amount of dailies can lead to burnout anyway, just like it did in Warcraft's Mists of Pandaria expansion. However, before I start coming across as a total commercial shill for Trion Worlds, I want to point out 2 things. 1, I'm not on Trion's payroll, and that'll probably become more apparent when I start addressing some of the more negative aspects of the game. And 2, Rift has other roadblocks that aren't associated with a monthly subscription fee. When creating your character, for example, there are some specs and an entire upcoming class that you can't select without purchasing them first. Then there's this, which I'll read straight from Trion's website. To limit gold farming, free players cannot sell items on the auction house and are restricted to 2,500 platinum. Both of these restrictions are lifted with any credit pack purchase, or credits purchased through Rex. Rex basically works like the Warcraft WoW token, only it's much, much more versatile. People spend real-life money for Rex, and then you can buy that Rex from them with in-game platinum. And once you have that Rex in your pocket, you can spend it on practically anything. Mounts, pets, services, patron status, whatever. Anyway, all these roadblocks are a minor concern to me. Honestly, a brand new player shouldn't be affected by them much anyhow. Newbies still have plenty of choices available to them when they're building their first character. And in terms of the platinum cap, if you hoard all your cash while leveling from 1 to 65, you might reach it, but probably not. I can't say for sure though, because I stupidly didn't think to keep track of my in-game income for review purposes. I totally dropped the ball on that account. As far as the auction house is concerned, I unlocked my access to it fairly early on, and I chose to level nothing but gathering professions. I thought it'd be an easy way to make some platinum, but even though the community seems rather active, and the server populations are typically listed at medium status, those low-level mats don't sell for shit. So playing the auction house is kind of difficult until you reach endgame content anyway. So overall, I'd say the purely free-to-play route is definitely doable, but spending a small amount of cash is certainly a good investment if you plan on staying for the long haul. I bought a cheap $20 credit pack, which of course lifted my platinum cap and unlocked the AH, and then I used my credits to buy my character some bag slots. There's another roadblock right there if you want to count that as one. You only get 1 bag slot to start with. The rest you have to pay for. If there's one thing I can't stand in these type of games, it's running out of bag space. However, if you're determined to remain free to play, you can circumvent the limited inventory issue by constantly clearing out your default bag space. The Rift store is always accessible everywhere you go, and fortunately it functions like a vendor. So you can unload your unwanted items and vendor trash at any time, no matter where you are. Had I have known this beforehand, I probably wouldn't have bothered unlocking as many bag slots as I did. Speaking of the Rift store, I'll just mention this real quick. I see a fair amount of people on various forums and so on bashing Trion for being overly excessive with the amount of stuff they have for sale. This is kind of a dumb complaint in my opinion, because Rift is completely free to play. They need to make their money somehow, and the stuff they sell is mainly for vanity or convenience, not necessity. The vast majority of these items in the Rift store have in-game currency price tags in addition to real-life money, so you can buy a lot of these things for free if you're willing to grind the platinum to do so. Surprisingly, there are some things you can only purchase with in-game currency. The first 8 bag slots in your bank, for example, can't be bought with real-life money. I was shocked. I wasn't expecting to see anything like that whatsoever in a free-to-play game. Having said all that, there are a couple items that are kinda pushing the boundaries of bad business, but I'll talk about those a little bit later on. Right now, I want to focus on the gameplay of Rift itself. There's no flying in Rift. If you want to get around, you're either walking on foot, riding on a ground mount, or hopping through stationary portals. This might be a deal breaker for some, but I'm managing to get by without it. I knew perfectly well going into the game that flight would never be an option. Fully exploring Talara while trying to climb up crooked buildings and steep mountainsides is kind of entertaining in its own right. If you slip and fall, there used to be a consequence for that. But for some reason, the devs removed all fall damage from the game. There are some rumors online saying Trion accidentally broke the fall damage mechanic and couldn't figure out how to fix it, but I have no idea if that's true or not. I couldn't find any official statement on the matter. Searching every nook and cranny of the world definitely has its benefits, if you're a digital pack rat like myself. There are tons of valuable artifacts scattered all over the place, represented as little glowing balls of light. When you pick them up, you'll see they fit together in specific sets, kind of like pieces of a puzzle. And with each set you complete, you can turn them in for various rewards. There are also books you can find lying all around the world, in old libraries and whatnot. You can add them to your personal collection, and even read them if you like. You can assemble a huge stockpile of mounts, companion pets, minion cards. Just trying to own everything in Rift is a game within itself. Wardrobe items are another great thing to try and collect. The Rift transmog system is amazing. In the last few days, I've just been grinding out old expert mode dungeons to both grab some easy cash and unlock some old gear models. When you pick up a weapon, for example, and it happens to be an art asset you haven't yet collected, the game will say, "You've unlocked a new wardrobe appearance." You can then immediately dispose of that weapon if you want, but its likeness will always be available in your wardrobe. And the wardrobe is account bound, so your alts can benefit from it too. You can also change your wardrobe appearance whenever you want, wherever you want, and it's completely free. The only cost associated with this system is totally optional. You only get one default wardrobe slot. If you want to save multiple transmog presets so you can switch through different outfits quickly, you'll need to spend a little money. And of course, the wardrobe slots get increasingly more expensive as you purchase them. Now let's take a look at leveling. The talent tree system in Rift was always one of the game's biggest selling points. There's a lot of flexibility in how players can build up their characters. But at the same time, if you think it's too complex, or you simply don't want to deal with it, you're given the option to let the computer automatically spend your talent points for you. I thought this was a good idea overall, a system that caters to both casual and hardcore players. I mainly leveled my mage through solo questing and by participating in Rift events, and even still, I never even came close to running out of outdoor content to do. Talara is huge, and I ended up skipping entire maps just to keep quest levels relevant to my character's level. So this by itself is great news. But, while the Rift mechanics seem to change and evolve over time, the questing itself seems somewhat average throughout. There were no quest objectives I completed that felt exceptionally great, but to their credit, they weren't utterly terrible either. Don't get me wrong, I certainly had fun while leveling. I just didn't find any specific quests to be worth raving about. There was a siege vehicle quest in the latest expansion area where I got to control a stationary turret. Unfortunately, the quest didn't last very long, and I didn't come across any additional noteworthy content of this kind. On the flip side, there are some truly unique looking landscapes in Rift. Impressive locations that really help make the overall gaming experience feel worthwhile. Cerratos is one of the better maps in my opinion. It was released with the Storm Legion expansion, and it's just littered with bones like some sort of graveyard wasteland. If I was forced to compare it to Warcraft, I'd say Cerratos is like Netherstorm and old school Plaguelands if they somehow got smashed together. Some other locations that are really extraordinary are the game's capital cities. I'm not talking about the original vanilla capitals, they aren't exactly anything special, but Tempest Bay and Margle Palace are astounding in both size and detail. It's funny to think, in terms of Trion versus Blizzard, that Trion has a smaller development team, a smaller player base, and therefore a smaller profit margin, yet they still somehow manage to craft amazing capitals. This seems to imply Trion has a certain passion that Blizzard is currently missing. Now, before anyone accuses me of overly praising Rift's capital cities simply as a means to bash WoW, I will say this. Margol Palace is perhaps too big for its own good. Every time I port there, my frame rate drops dramatically. And I'm not the only one who experiences this. It's a common complaint on the forums, even from players who say they have top-of-the-line computers. Just as a test, I tried lowering my video settings to see if I could raise my frame rate to a reasonable level, but it didn't really work. And honestly, even if it did, I'm not going to juggle those settings just to make Margol Palace my main hub of choice. I'll bind my soul to any other location instead. I guess now is a good enough time to dive into the other negative aspects of Rift. I'll talk about the map system first, because it's not entirely bad. I like the fact that it has a built-in coordinate system, for example. There's no need to download any third-party add-ons for such a simple yet necessary feature. I also like being able to set my own waypoints, so I can easily track the exact location I want to go. Yet another good aspect of the map is that it depicts rifts and invading forces fairly well. However, opening up my map lowers my frame rate. It's a noticeable annoyance, but thankfully not to a crippling degree. Also, the map textures look highly pixelized unless you zoom in extremely close to the ground. So, by the time you have a crystal clear view of things, the map is barely showing you any of the actual area around yourself. And my biggest complaint about the map system? Unless I'm speaking to one of the portal masters, if I'm in Classic Rift territory, I can only access the Classic Rift map. If I want to see the newest map, from the Plane of Water, I need to be standing in a Nightmare Tide expansion territory. As someone who's essentially new to Rift, I don't have many of the landmasses committed to memory, so these type of map restrictions can be quite frustrating at times. The auction house can be another minor inconvenience on occasion. Sometimes it runs perfect, providing smooth and flawless transactions. Other times it feels sluggish and unresponsive, like it's lagging or it just straight up froze. I'm not sure what to attribute this problem to exactly, but apparently it's been an issue for years according to the forums. Speaking of lag, sometimes I'll get hit with a massive lag spike from out of nowhere. I'll watch my latency icon jump from green to red instantly, and all my actions will grind to a screeching halt. It doesn't happen too often, and it usually never lasts beyond a few seconds max, but it's a common enough occurrence that I decided to mention it here. The game itself completely crashed maybe 5 or 6 times during my journey from level 1 to 65. The glyph launcher shut down a few times as well. But in all fairness to Trion, I doubt that's business as usual. I started playing Rift during a scheduled update. They recently released patch 3.3, Waking Nightmares, and it caused a ton of technical difficulties. Now that things have calmed down though, I haven't experienced any major issues. Also, to Trion's credit, they did a good job at communicating with players throughout the whole patch process, letting everyone know they were aware of certain problems and in the process of fixing them. I came across a few glitches while questing, 2 of which were bad enough to warrant me sending notices to the GMs, but with enough effort, I was still able to work around every glitch I encountered, and I never had to abandon a quest overall. Outside of questing, I completely fell through the world once, and I got stuck with some crazy bobblehead glitch in Tarkin Glacier. Ultimately, Rift is pretty solid in this regard. For those of you who don't know what a global cooldown is, it's the downtime after you use a spell or ability. That moment of time when your ability to use abilities is being refreshed. It's a system that's designed to prevent you from using multiple abilities at once. Unfortunately, Rift's global cooldown is slightly slower than WoW's, so Rift might seem less dynamic by comparison. After a while though, I adapted to it, and now it doesn't seem like a negative issue to me whatsoever. I'm mentioning it though, so I don't get a million YouTube comments saying I overlooked it. All these negatives aside, I'm now going to address the biggest, most controversial topic concerning Rift. Is the game pay to win? Well, the short answer is no, because if it was, I wouldn't have bothered to review the game, period. But I want to talk about the whole issue in more detail. This will also fully complete my thoughts on the in-game store, which I touched upon earlier. Bear in mind, I know nothing about raiding in Rift. So if you play Rift and you're a raider, let me know if I've said something wrong in the comments section below. But I'm guessing that raiders are currently working on the second tier of the Nightmare Tide expansion. So the current gear that drops from that second tier raid cannot be purchased with real life money. The previous tier 1 raid gear can be bought with real life money though, but each piece is really expensive. The cheapest item goes for 6,300 Rex, and the most expensive goes for 9,450 Rex. $50 will only buy you 8,500 Rex, so it's probably safe to say that most players don't buy this gear. So yeah, the in-game store sells raid gear as a catch-up mechanic, I guess, but it's outdated and far from cost-effective. If I were in charge, I wouldn't put gear in the store whatsoever, unless they were simple costume pieces without stats, but that's just my opinion. Another thing I don't particularly care for, but can manage to live with, are the way character earring slots were designed. It takes 100,000 void stones to unlock both earring slots on your character. You can only earn 47,000 void stones a week, max. So if you really push yourself and grind those stones to the max, in 2.5 weeks, you can unlock your earring slots for free. Or, you can skip the horrible void stone grind entirely, and simply buy the Nightmare Tide Collector's Edition box for $24.99. The same thing applies to gear flagged as Planewalker water gear. Every once in a while, in the current expansion zones, you'll get rewarded gear from quests that you can't use unless you attune yourself to the plane of water. There's no special quest chain here. You just have to fork over another 100,000 void stones for attunement. Or again, just buy the Nightmare Tide Collector's Edition box for $24.99. So we're not talking pay to win here, we're just talking pay to avoid horrible time gates and grind fests. That's kinda crappy, but not exactly game breaking. Trion isn't crossing the line, but they are standing awful close to it. Again, in my opinion, both gear and gear slots should never really be affected by real-life money purchases whatsoever. There are tons of other ways for developers to make money in free-to-play games. There's no real need to go to these extremes. Still, because the option to grind void stones does exist, I can overlook these issues. I just hope situations like these don't continue to accumulate or expand over time. A company's reputation is worth much more than whatever chump change they can make by purposely designing hurdles and then selling ways to avoid jumping said hurdles. Also, by the time you add earring slots to a character's profile, you're kinda running thin on personal real estate. I shudder to think what's next. I can imagine, a few years from now, being in a raid and yelling about the random number generator. This is bullshit. I've killed this stupid boss 12 times already, and my epic Prince Albert still hasn't dropped. So anyway, that's all I've got for today. I know there's a ton of stuff in Rift I still haven't talked about, the mentoring system, instant adventures, and so on, but I can't possibly cover the entire game in a single sitting. I really want to talk about Dimensions, for example, which is the Rift version of player housing, but there's so much to discuss that Dimensions deserve their own standalone video. All in all, I'd say my first, or technically second, impressions of Rift were quite positive overall. On a simple scale of keep or delete, I'm definitely going to keep this game installed on my computer. In the meantime, for those of you wondering which MMO I'm going to try next, it'll probably be WildStar, since the free-to-play version launches in just a few weeks, September 29th, 2015. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll talk to you later.